Everybody? Good, good, good. Good to see everybody out for Sunday school this morning. Now today we want to continue with our lesson from last week on Jezebel, Rahab, Abigail. Oh, Abigail. And for those who were not here last week, and to get all the rest of you up to speed on where we left off, let's do a little recap. Is that okay, Alicia? Because my memory is, I don't even hardly remember, so I'm kind of doing this for myself as well as for y'all. So with Abigail, we found an intelligent, a wise, beautiful lady who was married to a numbskull. Pretty much, right? Old Nabal. And old Nabal, he was a rich man. He owned 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. And David, who was the future king of Israel, along with 600 soldiers, had been guarding and protecting Nabal's shepherds and his sheep. And as a result, Nabal had not lost a single sheep, and his flock prospered. Now, it just so happened that it was sheep shearing season. And this season was a festive event where the person would invite neighbors, even enemies, friends, all over to his house to have a lot of food and a lot of drink. And David, being a shepherd boy, he was very much aware of the sheep shearing event. So he sent 10 of his men with a request for food and drink. Now, we already said that Nabal was a rich man, and he could have easily helped David. But when David's men asked Nabal politely for some provisions, Nabal insulted them. He basically spit in their face. He said, "Who are you guys? Why should I give anything to you?" So he basically offended the most powerful man in that region at that time, which was David. So David's men returned to David and told him the story. And obviously David became furious. And he said, "Okay, I'm going to take revenge." He told 400 of his 600 men to grab their swords because they were going to fight and destroy Nabal and his whole family. Now, one of Nabal's men was wise enough to know what was about to happen. So he went to Abigail, not to gossip about his master, but with the hope that he could help prevent their destruction. And as soon as Abigail heard this, of what her husband had done, she knew what David's reaction was going to be. So without telling her husband, she began gathering all the food and all the drink that she could get together beyond what was sufficient to feed David and his men. She basically prepared what we would call a feast for David and his men. So Abigail sent all these provisions of food and drink ahead of her on a caravan of donkeys. She knew David would be steaming mad, and she wanted to show goodwill and cool him down before she actually met him. And that's where we stopped last week. So let's continue with our scriptures this morning and see what happens when Abigail actually does meet David face to face. 1 Samuel chapter 25. If y'all will turn there. Are you already there, Diane? That's good. I was going to say, when Diane gets there, we'll begin, but she was already there. All right. Verses 23 through 25. And when Abigail saw David, she hasted and lighted off the ass and fell before David on her face and bowed herself to the ground and fell at his feet and said, Upon me, my Lord, upon me let this iniquity be. And let thine handmaid, I pray thee, speak in thine audience and hear the words of thine handmaid. Let not my Lord, I pray thee, regard this man of Belial, even Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, thine handmaid, saw not the young men of my Lord, whom thou didst send. So donkeys at this time were animals of the elite class of people. And riding a donkey to greet David, Abigail, it proved she was a classy lady. And when Abigail saw David, she immediately got off the donkey and bowed down to the ground at his feet. She humbly asked to speak to him, even though David was in no mood to listen to anybody. Nevertheless, he stopped to hear what Abigail had to say. He knew if he ignored her, he would be guilty of taking vengeance into his own hands. So then Abigail, she goes into the longest recorded speech of any woman in the Bible. She recognized the greatness of David and his future as a king. And even though she had more material possessions than David did, she placed herself in a position to offer him respect and humility. She then went on to tell him that her husband Nabal had lived up to his name, a fool, and how she had not been aware that David had sent his men to Nabal requesting food and drink. She then accepted full responsibility for the actions of her husband. It's amazing, isn't it? Even though she was not directly responsible for the turning away of his men. Verse 26. Now therefore, my Lord, as the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, seeing the Lord hath withholden thee from coming to shed blood, and from avenging thyself with thine own hand, now let thine enemies, and they that seek evil to my Lord, be as Nabal. So here Abigail is reminding David in a nice kind of way, Ralph, if he followed through with his intent, he, not Nabal, would be the guilty party. Verses 27 through 31. And now this blessing with thine handmaid hath brought unto my Lord, let it even be given unto the young men that follow my Lord. I pray thee, forgive the trespass of thine handmaid, for the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord fighteth the battles of the Lord, and evil hath not been found in thee all thy days. Yet a man is risen to pursue thee, and to seek thy soul, but the soul of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of life with the Lord thy God. And the souls of thine enemies, them shall he sling out, as out of the middle of a sling. And it shall come to pass, when the Lord shall have done to my Lord according to all the good that he hath spoken concerning thee, and shall have appointed thee ruler over Israel, that this shall be no grief unto thee, nor offense of heart unto the Lord, either that thou hast shed blood costless, or that my Lord hath avenged himself. But when the Lord shall have dealt with my Lord, then remember thine handmaid. So here Abigail, she demonstrates spiritual understanding by appealing to David's love of God and his righteousness. She didn't defend Nabal, but she did remind David of the consequences of his actions. If David were to kill or carry out his plan and kill Nabal, he would be taking the responsibility of vengeance away from God and putting it on himself. This wise woman also asked David how he was going to feel about this later if he did this. She knew after the heat of the moment had passed, David was going to feel guilty if he murdered Nabal. And as the future king of Israel, David would be happier if he were guilt-free in that position. So she continued on, and she reminded David that he was a man that pursued God's plans and fought for God himself. And David was being protected by the Lord because his enemies were always defeated. Why should he tamper with such a destiny by stooping to murder? Now, before we turn Abigail into a saint here, we do need to ask ourselves if she was actually acting in her own best interest. Think about that now. Because in the last part of verse 31, she did ask David to remember her once things were resolved in his favor. And we're going to talk about that more in a few minutes. So did David actually accuse Abigail of being a rebellious woman who refused to honor her husband's authority? No, he didn't. Did he think she stuck her nose in Nabal's business when she should have been home mopping the floor? No, he didn't say anything concerning this. Verses 32 through 35. And David said to Abigail, "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, which sent thee this day to meet me. And blessed be thy advice, and blessed be thou, which has kept me this day from coming to shed blood and from avenging myself with mine own hand. For in very deed, as the Lord God of Israel liveth, which hath kept me back from hurting thee, except thou hadst hasted and come to meet me, surely there had not been left unto Nabal by the morning light any that pisseth against the wall." So David received of her hand that which she had brought him, and said unto her, "Go up in peace to thine house. See, I have hearkened to thy voice, and have accepted thy person." Now, often when we are encountered in a hostile environment or an uncomfortable situation, the mention of the Lord's name changes everything. You know, Ansel's talked about it numerous times in his sermons. And Abigail's reference to the Lord immediately changed David's heart. He no longer had a heart to seek revenge. He now had a heart seeing the hand of the Lord at work in his life. In fact, David didn't chastise Abigail for speaking her mind. He didn't do that. He just praised the Lord for her and applauded her spiritual knowledge in preventing him from sinning. Moreover, he told her she had saved every person in her household. So what she did, Abigail, do you think it reflected her own interest? Well, you have to think, everything we've read, the life with Nabal was very unpleasant. And if David would have continued this plan, Abigail would have been left alone. without a husband, and also any type of means of support. So not even this possibility kept this godly woman from doing the right thing. We all need to do the right thing, don't we, Gary? You see it every day at work, people not doing the right thing. She had to intervene on her husband's behalf in the best interests of David. And Abigail is a good example for us of someone who made the best of her particular situation. She was obedient and godly, even with the poor example of righteousness that her husband had. Verses 36 through 38. And Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, he held a feast in his house, like the feast of a king. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunken. Wherefore she told him nothing, less or more, until the morning light. But it came to pass in the morning, when the wine was gone out of Nabal, and his wife had told him these things, that his heart died within him, and became as a stone. And it came to pass, after about 10 days after, that the Lord smote Nabal, that he died. So after Abigail's encounter with David, she went back home, and she found Nabal playing a fool again, oblivious to the possible danger that he had caused. He was drunk, and he was presiding over a festival banquet like a great king. Now you have to admire Abigail here. When she saw that Nabal was drunk and in a good mood, this would have been the perfect time to tell him what she had done. Would have gotten it off her mind. She wouldn't have to worry about it anymore. And he would not likely remember what she told him the next day. But this gutsy lady waited until early the next morning when he was sober. And when she told Nabal what she had done, the Bible don't say this, but you have to assume that Nabal lost it. We all know that he was a hostile man, and he most likely went into a rage and he became violent. Either way, he got so worked up over this that he either had a stroke or a heart attack, and 10 days later, he died. And this is a reminder to us how faithful God watches over us. And that he will indeed give us comfort when we are treated badly by wicked people around us. So backing up, do you think Nabal was a drunkard? Well, if you go to Mr. Google, he knows everything. There's some documentation that says he was, but the Bible don't tell us that. Until these verses right here, there's been no mention of any form of alcohol except for the wine that Abigail took to David. The only thing the Bible tells us is that Abigail was clever, she was beautiful, and Nabal was cruel and foolish. Moreover, if he was a drinker, the servant who tried to talk to him about this situation probably would have said so, but he didn't. Verses 39 through 42. And when David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Blessed be the Lord, that hath pleaded the cause of my reproach from the hand of Nabal, and hath kept his servant from evil. For the Lord hath returned the wickedness of Nabal upon his own head. And David sent and communed with Abigail to take her to him to wife. And when the servants of David were come to Abigail to Carmel, they spoke unto her, saying, David sent unto us thee to take thee to him to wife. And she arose and bowed herself on her face to the earth and said, Behold, let thine handmaid be a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord. And Abigail hasted and arose and rode upon an ass with 5 damsels of hers that went after her, and she went after the messengers of David and became his wife. So when David heard this news of Nabal's death, he rejoiced in the Lord. And he was so impressed with the beauty and wisdom of Abigail that he sent his servants to her with a message that he wanted to marry her. Just imagine Abigail's shock. Here, her husband had just died, which was probably a relief because the Bible don't say that. But she finds out that she is going to be the wife of the future king of Israel. Just listen to her response, which not many of us would say on our wedding day. Let thine handmaid be a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord. Laura, did you say that on your wedding day, that you'd wash Jeremy's feet? This time it was Abigail's choice whether or not to marry. And she accepted, became David's 3rd wife, and eventually the mother of his 2nd son, Chileab, or better known as Daniel. Remember Steve teaching us Daniel, the book of Daniel. So in summary, there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from the life of Abigail. And one of the most important ones is that a lot of heartache follows when a Christian marries an unbeliever. The tragedy in Abigail's life began when she married Nabal. And if you remember, we actually asked ourselves last week at the beginning of the lesson, why did she marry such a man? Why did such a lovely girl throw herself away upon such a brute of a man? Well, according to the customs of those times, marriages were a family arrangement, with the woman having little to say about the choice of a husband. Now, it was obvious that Nabal was a rich man, came from a wealthy family, and was rich in his own right, which seemed like a good catch for Abigail. But a person's character should be considered before their possessions in a marriage. Amen? Abigail was definitely a courageous woman who made the best out of a very difficult situation. She knew that Nabal, just out of plain good hospitality and gratitude, should have given David's men what they asked for. Mainly because they had been protecting him for years. Yet when David sought vengeance, Abigail stepped in, making David realize that this vengeance wasn't something that was up to him or her to give. But we do see amazing strength in this woman through her desire to protect her household and her unworthy husband. And years of living with Nabal hadn't made Abigail bitter. The Bible didn't say anything about that. nor had the years caused her to want to get revenge on this man. Never saw that either. But the Lord honored Abigail for her consistency, her generosity, and her willingness to continue on the right path, no matter how difficult it was. And in that same way, God continues to honor those people who are faithful, even when faithfulness brings difficulty and hardship and pain. Now back to wives and husbands. Colossians chapter 3, verse 18. The Bible talks about wives respecting their husbands. Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husband, as it is fit in the Lord. So Abigail somehow manages to show kindness and respect to a man it was difficult to love. A man who even set himself up against the servant of God. She seeks to protect him and looks out for his reputation and his well-being. She protects her home where a husband does not. She leads where he fails. And in doing so, she not only honors her husband, but she shows honor to God as well. Now, a lot of women in this world today will see all of their future husbands' faults and his failures and think after marriage she can reform him. This typically don't happen. In fact, a lot of times the husband becomes more evil. Just think about it. We see this all the time today. All those brave, unmurmuring wives who have to live with a fool of a husband who's drunken, his crude ways are causing misery in their marriage. There are a lot of those women out there. I'm sure we all know them. And we all know that God does not always remove us from bad situations, but he does help us through those bad situations. Now, don't take this the wrong way. God does not like an abusive marriage. And I personally am not suggesting that a spouse stay in an abusive marriage. To me, a man that abuses his wife is about as low as you can get. I have no respect for a man that beats his wife. And the Bible tells us how a man should treat his wife. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 25, 28, and 33. Verse 25, husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. Verse 28, so ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. In verse 33, nevertheless, let every one of you in particular so love his wife even as himself, and the wife see that she reverence her husband. So the bottom line is, if you have yet to make a commitment to pray for your spouse, you need to do that today. Set aside a few minutes to surrender your marriage to God, specifically asking him to bless your spouse. Try to refrain from focusing on all this laundry list of complaints that you have with your spouse. Instead, pray for the needs that you know your spouse has. And that God to shape your marriage and your relationship and use it for his purpose. Marriage should not be a total war trying to control your spouse. Instead, just ask God to work in your spouse's life. Now, in the very end of this story, Abigail became David's wife. And David went on to become one of the greatest kings of Israel. And you know why that was? Because behind every successful man is an Abigail. I appreciate y'all's attention this morning. And I hope you've gotten something out of this story on Abigail. As always, it is an honor and a privilege for me to be able to come up here and teach